Welcome to Making Democracy Work, the League of Women Voters Honolulu County's monthly television show focused on community interests. Today, we are welcomed by Ann Anderson, the chair of the DC League of Women Voters, Committee for Full Rights for DC Citizens. Hi, Ann, welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
I'm so glad that you're here with us today. Can you tell us about your duties as the chair of the Committee for Full Rights for DC Citizens?
Yes, well, we really are focused. I mean, when we say full rights, what we're really talking about is both representation in our national legislature, which means statehood. And then, of course, when we become a state, then we have full local control of our activities at the local level. So for me, it's about talking to people like you and, getting the word out. We've done a lot of traveling around the country. We've traveled to 30 states talking to leagues around the country. And when I say we, because we have a whole group of people who are ready to provide the presentation, and we have PowerPoints that we make up, and then lots of coalition building things, and just making sure that people understand what it's like to live in Washington, D.C. and not have a vote in Congress at all. So,
well, that sounds un-American. How'd that happen?
Indeed. Well, back in 1801, which was when Congress moved into DC and took it over as the nation's capital, from one day to the next, we were disenfranchised. They just said, no, you can't vote. Up till then, even though there'd been 10 years of where Maryland had given some land and Virginia had given some land, then the people who still lived in the Maryland side and the Virginia side, they still voted in their old states. But when 1801 came along, they said, no, you can't vote. And just to be clear, even back then, you can go to the congressional record and see that people were like, wait a minute, I think we just turned DC citizens into subjects. And this is not a good idea. We have a problem here. But they kicked the can down the road because there weren't very many people, and, we'll figure it out. And there were a whole bunch of things that were tried. I mean, lots of different options for giving local control and local self-government and, lots of different things. But none of them worked really well. And I probably ought to talk a little bit, Chris, about the territorial government that was established after the Civil War. It was in the 1870s. And they're like, all right, people really, we need to have this. We need to have some local control. So they established a territorial government. And there was a governor and an appointed upper house and then an elected lower house. And, the problem was that Washington, D.C. was actually full of people who were freed slaves, freed men, and they started organizing, and it became clear that people were going to get elected to the lower house. And again, if you go to the congressional record, you'll see that there are plenty of places where they're like, well, we can't have this happen. And so basically they just wiped it out, which is what the Congress can do. Congress has total control over the District of Columbia. That's what it says in the Constitution. So they wiped out the territorial government that they had established and installed a government of 3 commissioners that lasted for almost 100 years until the 1960s, where, the civil rights movement really, came on hard. So, and then people in DC had no vote, no nothing. So that's how it happened.
Well, what changed in the 1960s that moved you all towards a small semblance of democracy?
Well, the civil rights movement was like, excuse me, but look, we have a lot of people who live in DC and they don't have a vote at all. And President Johnson was the one who first changed the 3-commissioner thing to a mayor commissioner, and he appointed Walter Washington, one of 3 Black folks who ended up being mayors of cities at the time. And then eventually he also appointed a local council, which then eventually ended up, we actually ended up getting, to make a long story short, we ended up getting limited home rule so that we got to actually vote for a mayor and a DC council and, those kind of things. But even before then, we actually got an amendment to the Constitution that allowed us to vote for president. So in 1964 was the first time that people were allowed to vote for president in Washington, DC. And that was the first time actually that in my life that I had an opportunity to vote, because I got old enough to do that. And it was an amazing experience to watch people come out of the polling booth and go, I voted. I actually voted. Mm-hmm. And it was, yeah. So, I've been watching democracy grow since then. So, because that's really, really what's happened. And since then, we've tried all kinds of things to get ourselves more representation. So, there was a constitutional amendment that was tried to treat DC as if it were a state, which had to go through state legislatures, and that failed. That was in the late 70s.
Tell us more about the geography of DC. Some of us may not be that familiar with it.
Okay. Well, it really is. If you think about a diamond, and then you cut off a piece at the Potomac River, because that's the part that went back to Virginia. Then you have this part and this part, that's Maryland, that has a boundary with Maryland. And it also has the Anacostia River coming through. So we have 2 rivers. And then we have some really lovely parkland and a number of, we have a bunch of different communities. We're very diverse. We're a very international city and I would say district. And so, when you walk along the street, you might hear 3 or 4 languages, spoken just by the people who are walking along the street, which is really neat. I like it. So,
what's the population of DC and how does it compare to the size of traditional states that we have in our nation?
That's a really good question. So right now we have 712,000 plus. We keep growing. That's more than Wyoming, more than Vermont, and very close to 4 others. Like there's North Dakota, South Dakota. I'm going to forget those other, but we're sort of on par with 6 others. If you go and look at the states that have sort of under 1 million, we're sort of in that territory. Mm-hmm. And if you look at all the states that have enough only enough population to have one at-large congressman, that's us. So,
Alaska.
oh yeah, exactly.
What would the geographical size be? It'd be probably the smallest state, wouldn't it?
In terms of miles, yes,
Mm-hmm.
we're 67 square miles, about like that. So if you take out the 2 mile square, we'd be 65 square miles. Now, let me just point out that, back in the day when the U.S. was established, that decision about the territorial size of states was decided. It's like, well, it doesn't matter whether you're a little tiny thing like Delaware or a big old thing like New York or whatever. What really counts is people.
Mm-hmm.
You're enfranchising people, not land. So we think we need to be enfranchised because we have plenty of people to be on par with, 10 states. So
Absolutely. And how is DC currently federally represented? How does government work there?
Well, we have a delegate, a non-voting delegate to Congress. Her name is Eleanor Holmes Norton. She's been a fabulous voice for us. She, at this moment in time, has limited vote. Like, she can vote in committees. She can even vote in the committee of the whole. But when it comes to a final vote on the House floor, she can't vote. I mean, nobody can. I mean, none of the delegates that represent the territories, like Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands or Marianas or Guam. There's a fifth one and I'm not remembering it right now. But they don't have a vote on the House floor, but one of the things I really want to be clear about is territories do not pay federal income tax. DC pays federal income tax. We pay federal income tax equivalent to 22 states.
22 states combined?
No.
Okay. So on par with 22 states. Well, it sounds like you're paying. You should get your representation. So you just have the one non-voting delegate, right? So
right.
is there
and we
any?
got nobody in the Senate.
Oh.
There's nothing in the Senate. We don't even have a voice in the Senate.
Well, all states should have senators.
Well, you would think that if you are subject to the laws that our Supreme Court decides, that we should have some voice in deciding who should be on the Supreme Court, for instance.
Yeah. And that leads me to an important question. So you all have no senators. You have a non-voting delegate. You get taxed like everyone else who lives in a state. But how do your judges get picked? And who are the judges in DC for the residents there?
Well, the judges are appointed by the President of the United States. And all of the things that federal judges would do, I mean, all of our criminal part is federalized. So we don't have, we do have, supposedly, we have an advisory board that says these would be a good set of people, and depending on who the president is, they might pay attention or not, but it's only advisory. So we have no real say in how the judges are chosen. And then, of course, since our criminal justice system is federalized, that means when you go to prison under a federal charge, then you go to a federal prison somewhere in the country. And that could be in any place, which is so harmful to the future capacity of prisoners to come back and rejoin their communities and their families. Because you can't, I mean, people can't go visit if you're in a prison in Illinois or, Arkansas or Oregon. I mean, that's where they are. It's just really, it's extremely painful.
Well, I'm sorry.
Well, if we, when I'm going to say if, and I'm going to say when we become a state, part of what we would do would be to take back all of those judicial functions, so that we would then run our own judicial system. So it's
my understanding that not only do you have representatives, but at the beginning you mentioned that Congress, has full authority. What are some of the ways that they have interfered with the elected government in DC over the course of the years that you all have had control, which has not been all that long? It sounded like 45 years.
Right. It's since, the limited home rule was established in 1974. So, basically what happens is we say, okay, let's go to the DC Council because we want to improve our schools, right? So we get a whole bunch of things through, and we, how you have to do. You have to work really hard to get a point across and get something through a legislative body. And then the legislative body, the DC Council says, okay, we're going to do it. And they pass the bill and it becomes a law, and the mayor signs it, and then it goes to Congress for their 30-day review. And sometimes it's 60 days, depending on what kind of legislation it is. But basically, now that's not 30 calendar days. That's 30 legislative days. So every law that we pass here basically says, and it shall become law upon the end of the congressional review. So you don't know when it's going to happen. It could be 6 months. It could be 8 months. You don't know. But anyway, that's when it becomes law. It's a little difficult to plan things. Then, of course, if the Congress decides, and many times people decide, especially on social policies that are their favorite things, that DC will do this or won't do this, then that goes by the wayside. And they often attach riders, to, like, a regular legislation goes in, and then you're like, well, but no, we want to add this little amendment to this piece of legislation. So, for instance, they often have riders. Well, here's a perfect example. People in the Congress didn't like needle exchange. Proven way to reduce HIV/AIDS and reinfections or infections. So they said, well, you can't do needle exchange in DC. And that happened for like 8 years in a row. And DC ended up with the highest HIV/AIDS infection rate in the country. We're talking lives here, right? Now, the proof of the pudding is that there were a couple of years when they didn't get that rider done. And guess what? We were able to put in a needle exchange program, and our infection rate dropped substantially. So that's just one piece. But that's the kind of thing, and I think one of the things that people don't understand or don't can't figure out is how you always have to keep looking over your shoulder. And you can't just say, okay, I passed it, we're done. At this point in time, we'll have the change we want, and then we can go forward. And now let's start dealing with the next problem, because, our communities have all kinds of problems. No, you got to keep watching. Is it going to get taken away?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's that time, I think it was medical marijuana, where Congress didn't even let us, we had a referendum. Congress did not allow us to count the votes on the referendum. We had to go to court to get a vote count, which took about a year and a half. So
it is no fun to have this higher authority above your local government telling you what to do, interfering with, the will of the people, not allowing them to be represented. This all sounds eerily familiar to scenarios that happened out here in Hawaii before statehood occurred, in that 50, 60-year interim in between the overthrow and and new statehood, and all the things that went on as a territorial government back then, all the anti-democratic things that went on. With all that you've told us, Anne, so far, what can folks out here in Hawaii do in support of the League of Women Voters and support of DC statehood, so that you all can have proper democratic representation? Because as America's capital city, it sounds like a rather undemocratic place at the moment.
Well, it is. So here's what I think is the most important thing, and that is talk to your people. Talk to your people. Like I said, I've been traveling around the country, I haven't personally, but my team has traveled to 30 states. And invariably, we find that people do not understand, don't get it, until we actually stand there in front of them and say, you take a legislator, you vote for your representative, and you send him, her to Congress, and you expect them to take care of your business, right? But when they get to the Hill, they become in charge of me, because, they can do whatever they please with the District of Columbia.
And their authority.
Yes, they have complete authority over the District of Columbia. So what I think people can do is to say, hey, this is not a good idea. This is not American. We need to change this. When we go to congressional offices to discuss this, the DC Statehood Coalition does that. Often we hear congressmen and senators say, well, we haven't heard much from our constituents. I don't know, So constituents saying, this is important to me. This is really something that I care about. I would like to fix this hole in our democracy, and it's a glaring hole right here in the nation's capital. I don't like it. And you don't need to know a lot. You just need to know that it shouldn't work this way, And if they say, well, we don't know much about it, they're like, well, let me suggest that you go to the League of Women Voters of the District of Columbia website, because we have lots of information about all of this on our website.
And that website is lwvdc.org for everyone who's looking for it. And there's a DC statehood toolkit that has been very informative and helpful. As the youngest state, we would be happy to see a new state come along and be fairly represented in our nation, because it's no way to live without federal representation. You just get picked on, and unfairly, besmirched because they can poke at you.
That's right. With no. So, do we have time to talk about January 6th? I lost
Um,
track.
we have about a minute and a half left. Yeah, I would love to hear about January 6th in the Capitol.
Yeah, the insurrection that took place. I think it's really important that people understand, because we often get tarred with, some weird feather. That we have specific rules under which we can call up the National Guard. And we actually have a video that we made that details that, which you can find on our website too. But we weren't able to do it. Our mayor could not just call up the National Guard. She had to go through the Department of Defense, and her request was denied for an hour and a half. So she called before 2, and they weren't able to get there until 5. And if we'd been a state, we would have been able to have more people supporting our Capitol Police.
And you all have a National Guard.
Yes.
It's not like you don't have one. You have thousands of troops.
Exactly. But we weren't allowed to bring them up. So.
Well, let's get that changed. That was a completely unsafe situation where people died, and the guards at the Capitol, the police, were overrun, and it could have been worse, and it was already so much worse than any of us imagined.
Yeah.
How did that make you feel?
I felt I'm still so sad for the people, those policemen, who are my neighbors. Mm-hmm. Many of them are my neighbors. And I mean, it wasn't just, there are like over 150 policemen who were injured, so I'm just so sad, and all about a lie, and all because we weren't able to support them. Just dreadful.
Thank you, Anne. I really appreciate your time. Ann Anderson, the chair of the DC League of Women Voters Committee for Full Rights for DC Citizens. I appreciate your time today.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
All right. Have a great day. And I should just mention your website one more time, lwvdc.org.